The Xiaomi Redmi Note 7s is the company's latest budget offering, which joins the recently announced Redmi Note 7 family. The main feature of this phone is its 48 megapixel sensor, which Xiaomi has managed to bring at an even lower price compared to the Redmi Note 7 Pro. Now, the difference between the 48 MP sensor on the 7S versus the 7 Pro is that the Redmi Note 7S uses a Samsung GM1 sensor, whereas the 48 megapixel one on the Note 7 Pro uses a Sony IMX586, which is the same one used in the OnePlus 7 Pro. Now, both of them have large pixel sizes of 1.6 microns, have face detection autofocus, and relatively wide apertures of f1.8. Now, while the main focus of this test is on the 48 megapixel sensors, it wouldn't really be a proper camera comparison without testing the selfie cameras as well. So we've done that. Now, before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you're notified when we have a new video. Now, without wasting any more time, it's time to see which phone has the better 48 megapixel sensor. Now, in our first test, the AI in the Redmi Note 7 Pro aggressively boosts the color of the sky, which looks striking but isn't very accurate. The Redmi Note 7S, on the other hand, has slightly brighter image, so objects in the shadows are more visible. However, in terms of pure image quality and detail, the Redmi Note 7 Pro is better. It gets the exposure right on the building, and details are also very well defined. The image from the Redmi Note 7S looks a bit washed out and the colors are a bit paler. Looking at the trees and objects on the side of the frame, the Redmi Note 7 Pro also cleans up the noise very well, which is not the case with the Note 7S. Now, in our second daylight test, it's actually pretty neck and neck between the two, making it hard to pick a definitive winner. Both shots have equally good color saturation and detail. Now, if you were to nitpick, then the Redmi Note 7 Pro does a marginally better job in handling noise on objects around the side of the frame. Now, both phones have the ability to shoot at full 48 megapixel resolutions too, so we thought we'd put this to the test to see which one captures the best details. We revisit our first landscape test, only this time at its full sensor resolution. The color characteristics remain the same. The 48 megapixel shot from the 7 Pro offers better detail when compared to the Note 7S. At night, the Note 7 Pro produces a more realistic looking shot, while the Redmi Note 7S boosts the colors of the sky a bit too much. However, the Note 7S actually has a slightly cleaner image here once you zoom in all the way. Now, in our first macro test, we have an assortment of colors and textures to challenge the sensors. Here, the Note 7 Pro captures more accurate colors as the reds on the roses are more evident compared to the pinkish hue on the Note 7S. The level of detail is pretty good on both phones. In the second sample, the orange color of the flower is once again more accurately represented by the Redmi Note 7 Pro, while the 7S captures a slightly yellowish shade. Both capture good details, however, if you zoom in really close, you notice that the edges are slightly better defined on the Note 7 Pro compared to the Note 7S. We begin with a regular portrait shot of a person shot under outdoor lighting. Here, the Redmi Note 7 Pro has noticeably better skin tones and exposure. The Note 7S, on the other hand, overexposes the shot, in turn burning the highlights on our subject's t-shirt and face. In portrait mode, neither of the phones let you adjust the background blur while shooting, but with the Redmi Note 7 Pro, you can adjust it from the gallery, which the Note 7S doesn't allow. The Note 7S also misses out on extra features in this mode such as lighting effects and beautification filters. When shooting people, the Redmi Note 7 Pro has more balanced looking shot with good exposure, skin tones and a natural looking background blur. The Redmi Note 7S overexposes the shot, blowing out the highlights in the background. The blur effect also looks a little forced. Colors are a little washed out too, and our subject's face is a bit over-sharpened. When shooting objects, it takes a while for the portrait effect to successfully kick in. This is why the perspective of both the samples looks slightly off as we were constantly adjusting our hand position. In the final shot, the Redmi Note 7 Pro clearly has a lead here as it produces a sharper image with better colors. For selfies, beautification was left to the default setting and AI was kept on. Both phones capture good colors and detail, however, upon zooming into the image, we notice that the Redmi Note 7 Pro has a cleaner image with less grain in the background. As far as skin tones go, we do prefer the shot captured by the Redmi Note 7S, and this is the one we'd pick if we had to choose a winner. When shooting at night and outdoors, Both phones produce grainy images, but the Redmi Note 7S produces a more usable one, as the size of the grain isn't very distracting, unlike the Note 7 Pro. With the screen flash enabled, the Redmi Note 7 Pro produces better skin tones since it has a brighter screen flash compared to the Note 7S. Now, both phones do a decent job with blurring out the edges in portrait mode around the subject's face, but once again we have to hand it to the Redmi Note 7S for getting the skin tones just a bit better. We shot our first low-light sample at dusk, and here the Redmi Note 7S produces a better looking image compared to the Note 7 Pro. The warmer color tone really brings out the color of the sky and the surrounding buildings, making the image pop a little. The Redmi Note 7 Pro has a more neutral color tone in comparison. Details on both though are roughly the same. At night, the Redmi Note 7S manages to capture slightly better details in distant objects. The difference is not major and it's only noticeable if you compare them side by side and you really zoom in. The image is also brighter compared to the Redmi Note 7 Pro, which brings out the detail in the shadow regions. We see a similar trait when shooting macros under low light. Both phones produce similar detail, but the Redmi Note 7S once again has a slightly warmer tone compared to the more neutral tone on the Redmi Note 7 Pro. It's the same story in our second sample too. The Redmi Note 7S has a slightly warmer tone and produces slightly less noise compared to the Note 7 Pro, but in this case it does blow out the highlights a bit, which the other handles better. Both phones have a night mode which takes a couple of seconds longer to save the shot, but the final image does have much better exposure. In a landscape shot, the Redmi Note 7S has a comparatively noisy image, but the exposure is a little better, so details in the shadows are better visible. Details and colors are very similar, but if you have to pick one, we'd go with the Redmi Note 7 Pro. Shooting a close-up image, the Redmi Note 7 Pro produces a sharper image, but at the cost of a little noise. The Note 7S has a comparatively softer image, but it's cleaner with lesser noise. For the video test, we set the resolution 1080p at 30fps since the Redmi Note 7S doesn't support 4K. Electronic stabilization is present on both phones and it works pretty well when shooting in daylight. Audio is crisp and image quality is pretty good. In low light, however, the Redmi Note 7 Pro has a much better image quality. Footage is mostly clean with very less visible noise. Stabilization works well too, but it does create some distortions when you have artificial light sources around. The Redmi Note 7S has a comparatively noisy image, and the image quality and colors aren't as good. We also tested the slow motion mode, which lets you shoot a 1080p video at 120fps. Once again, image quality is decent and the slow motion effect is pretty good on both phones. I think we can confidently conclude that the Redmi Note 7 Pro does have the better 48 megapixel sensor compared to the Redmi Note 7S. It won the majority of our tests, not counting the ones where both phones had a tie for first place. Now, if we were to summarize the characteristics of both primary cameras, then the Redmi Note 7 Pro tends to capture a more neutral color tone with better noise reduction and detail in daylight. Low light shots tend to be slightly noisy when compared to the Note 7S, but it does have better video quality in low light. The Redmi Note 7S on the other hand has generally a higher exposure and a warmer color tone. This works in its favor when shooting in low light, but in daylight, we often encountered overblown highlights and colors weren't always accurate. Overall, the Redmi Note 7S does have a pretty capable camera, especially at that price. However, it's just not as good as its slightly more expensive cousin. So thanks for watching our camera comparison, and for all things tech, log on to gadgets360.com.